Okay. All right. So hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out on, I'm sure, a busy weeknight. I want to learn something with you tonight, as we've done a few times now, in honor of the yard site of my grandfather. I've been doing this for my two grandfathers. This is for Martin Horowitz, who was my mother's father. And before I get into the shiur, I want to say a few words about my grandfather, because it was funny. I was reminiscing with my mom over the weekend, and we were talking just about my grandfather's life. And as we were going through it, I know this may be obvious, but when you think about people of his generation and the things that they saw in one lifetime, it's almost impossible to imagine some of the silly things that we worry about in our daily lives. And these are people who really lived through history and some ups and downs, clearly. And so I'm just going to very quickly go through a very brief outline of his life, and hopefully it'll get across just a few things about him. So my grandpa was born in 1905 in a small town in what today we would call Poland, though back then, before World War I, it wouldn't have been called that. And the Great War, as they would have called it back then, actually ended right around the time of my grandfather's bar mitzvah. So it gives a sense of kind of his time frame. He was an orphan who was sent to live with his uncle. And so his first cousins were like his adopted siblings. And I'm actually named for one of those first cousins that was like a brother to him. My grandfather moved to America in 1929 at the age of 24, just in time for the Great Depression to hit, just in time for his arrival. And I guess you could say that my grandpa missed the roaring 20s. Instead, he lived through the Polish 20s, which I assume were not quite as roaring. My grandfather didn't talk much about his days in the old country. And when he did, he got very emotional. And it seemed pretty clear to me that he was very thankful to have had the opportunity to leave Europe when he did, as not all of his family was as lucky. And my middle name is actually for one of his brothers who didn't make it out of Europe. He was in the US Army during World War II. So by the time that war ended, he was not a young man. And you could say that he'd seen a lot in his life, but he was lucky to live a long life into his 90s, and he was incredibly productive. I knew more about, I guess you could say, the back half of his life, at which point he moved out west. He married my grandma, raised a family. He was a successful entrepreneur. And I know that I knew him, and I'm sure that the people on this Zoom who knew him would appreciate that he was just a warm and sensitive, understated man who never pursued the spotlight, but he gave a tremendous amount back to his community. So for me, he was just a tremendous role model that I was lucky to know growing up. And some of you will remember that a little while ago, it's about 6 months ago, I gave a shiur like this, and we talked about this word in Hebrew that was hard to translate into English. That word was bedieved, and that's a discussion for another time. But as I was preparing for this, I thought about another word, and it's the word yahrzeit. It's just another great word that we have in our culture that doesn't translate well into English. And I think that's very telling. You know, in English, we have the word birthday, but we clearly don't have the word death day. And even saying the word death day sounds kind of silly when you say that out loud in English. But over the years, and especially in recent years, I've really embraced this custom of using a date on the calendar to think about my grandparents and to share memories about them with my kids and to do something in their honor with friends and family and in the context of the Jewish community that they love so much. So again, I appreciate everyone coming out to participate in that. So, okay, with that, let's dive into the shiur itself. So tonight, I want to share some thoughts with you based on a beautiful piece by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Rabbi Sachs died in November of last year. And since then, I've made an effort, especially to go back and read or reread some of his writings. And it's funny because I only heard Rabbi Sachs speak in person a handful of times, but I've actually come to think of him truly as a teacher, which is amazing, really mostly through his writings. So I'm excited to share a thought of his and riff on it a little bit, expand on it a little bit. But before we get there, just to set things up, let's start with an amazing story that's told in the Midrash Tanhuma. It's a story, a famous story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, talking to a pagan about the laws of paraduma, of the red heifer. Okay, so let me see if I can put that on screen and we'll go through it together. Okay, so hopefully you can all see now. This is the Midrash Tanchuma reads in Parshat Chukat. It says, Sha'al Oved Kochavim Echad et Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. A certain pagan asked the following question of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. It said, Ilin milin da'atun avdin, nirin kemin kshafin. These things that you do, these practices of yours, appear like sorcery. That's the question. That's like the aggressive question of this pagan. So he says, I'm going to go through it in English. You bring a heifer, you burn it, you pound it, you take its ashes, and then when one of you is defiled by a corpse, they sprinkle 2 or 3 drops on him, and someone says to him, you're clean. So he said to him, this is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai responding, he said, have you ever had the spirit of madness enter you? The pagan told him no. He said to him, perhaps you've seen someone into whom the spirit of madness has entered. He told him yes. So he said to him, first of all, it's hilarious. So he says, I have seen someone possessed by a mad spirit. So he's like, okay, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, great. So what did you do for him? He says to him, they bring roots, burn them beneath him, then they sprinkle water and the spirit on the spirit, and it flees. So Rabban Yochanan turns to him and he says, let your ears hear what you're uttering with your mouth. Right? Basically, you poked at our practices. Now I ask you about you, and you tell me about your practice, which doesn't seem all that terribly different. And that's the end of that conversation. Okay? But the end of the Midrash is perhaps the most fascinating, because this is how the Midrash ends. It says, Le'achar sheyatza, after the pagan leaves, Amru lo talmidav, his students said to him, Lazeh dachita bekaneh. Says you were able to push this one off with a reed, so with a flimsy argument. Lanu ma ta'omer. But what are you going to answer us? These are his students. Okay, so he says, Amar lahem, he said to them, Chayechem, lo hamet metameh, lo hamayim metari. He says, in fact, by your lives, in fact, the dead does not defile and the water does not purify. Ella, zerato shel melech malchei hamlachim. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hukach hakakti lachem gzera gazarti, ein ata rashai la'avor al gzerati. Dichtiv zot chukat haTorah. He says, basically, he says, the corpse does not defile, the water doesn't purify. Rather, it's Hashem says, I've enacted for you a statute, I've issued a decree, you're not allowed to transgress. In short, because God said so. Okay, so that's 2 different answers to 2 different crowds. Okay, so let me stop sharing and let's think about that. So let's think about this Midrash. So first, I think you have to think about the context of the story. So Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai lived at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. And you can only imagine that at that time, it would have actually been very reasonable for a Roman to walk up to a Jewish person and say, why do you keep your silly laws? Like, after all, you have been defeated, right? Why do you keep these silly laws? And for even Jewish students to ask their teacher after the Roman leaves, what answer do you have for us? Why should we continue to follow in these ways? And when I think about the story that way, then suddenly this 2,000-year-old story, I think, has a lot of resonance, especially for people in our community. Because if you think about it, we live in a community of Jews that interacts with the outside world. And we're often asked, why do you keep these rituals, right? When we take time off on holidays no one's ever heard of, when you take the second day of Shmini Atzeret off, or when you don't eat like everybody else. There are a million times where our friends and colleagues will ask us why. Okay, so that's kind of question number 1, paragraph number 1. But then these why questions don't just come from the outside. In our community, we and our children also want to know answers for ourselves, right? Why do we do these things? Why do we focus so much on passing on our particularities down to our children? Like the students in the Midrash, the Midrash puts it in the mouth of the students and our children, and we will ask, right? What answer will you give us? Okay. So I think I went through that Midrash. First of all, I think it's very fascinating, but I think it's also a fitting intro to to learning a piece by Rabbi Sachs, because Rabbi Sachs spent his life answering these two sets of questions that Jews have been asked for millennia. From the outside, why do you do this? From the inside, why should I do this? Okay, and he knew better than anyone probably in our time how to explain Judaism to these two very different audiences. He knew how to express the wisdom of Judaism to non-Jews in a way that they could relate to and have some level of understanding. But at the same time, he had the ability to convey the distinctiveness of Judaism to Jews in a way that would inspire them. And Rabbi Sachs, as you read more and more of his work, you see that he had this method that allowed him to be successful in speaking to these two audiences. And he did this over and over. So the method is that first, you bring to bear a range of non-Jewish sources. They might be from literature, the latest scientific discoveries, political science, and philosophy. He would bring all of these, and he would show that Jewish tradition fits into a larger conversation and more than holds its own as a contributor in any thoughtful discussion about consequential issues, okay? So that's kind of step one, but then he would go further and he would bring a wide range of traditional Jewish sources. And he would show that Tanakh and the rabbis, Chazal, were actually ahead of their time and intuited or grappled with the same set of issues, some issues that wouldn't come to the forefront of scholarship or culture for hundreds or even thousands of years later. So tonight, I want to use as an example, and we'll see this kind of double move that Rabbi Sachs uses so often. I want to use as an example studying the way that Rabbi Sachs explains the Jewish legal category of chok, right? We say chukim. And it's fitting that we do this at this time of year. Part of what got me thinking to talk about it was that now we have Parshat Chukat coming up in just a couple of weeks, and the word chok is showing up more often in the Parshiot. So anyways, I thought this was also just a particularly beautiful piece of Rabbi Sachs's that we could learn together. So, okay, a bit of background. So the Torah uses many words to describe different types of mitzvot. If you think about from the Haggadah, the wise son's question, he says, Ma ha'idot v'hachukim v'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu etchem. He says, what are these idot and chukim and mishpatim, right? He's giving different names for different types of laws, and the Torah includes even more names than that. So laws in the category of chukim specifically include a wide range of Jewish rituals. So for example, as we're going to speak about, purification via the paraduma, okay, that's a chok. That's the beginning of Parshat Chukat, okay? And then you have the ritual of the Seir Hamishtaleh, right? The scapegoat that's sent into the wilderness on Yom Kippur. But you have other chukim. The word chok is used for the laws of kashrut, right? Restrictions on what we can eat. Or for shatnez or kilayim, other restrictions, religious restrictions on mixing things, mixing species in the way that we plant or the way that we dress. And the term chok is actually used more widely than you might realize. So it includes, for example, the laws of blowing the ritual trumpets, the chatzotzrot, both in times of war and on holidays. Okay, so those are also in the category of chukim, but generally when we talk about chukim, what we tend to mean is these hard to rationalize laws where it's hard to pin down exactly what they're getting at. That's usually what we mean when we talk about chok. And so examples would be, why are the ashes of a red cow purifying? Or why am I restricted from eating or wearing such and such? These are prototypical Jewish practices where outsiders question them, and even Jews sometimes wonder what they're about. So in a beautiful piece called Neuroscience and Ritual, Rabbi Sachs gives his explanation of a way to think about these mysterious laws, these chukim. And he extends the conversation, interestingly, to include a way of thinking about ritual in general. So he begins by laying out what came before him. He lays out two strands of Jewish thought in thinking about why the Torah includes these mysterious, kind of hard to rationalize laws. So the first school of thought is that the whole point of these laws is that they have no apparent meaning. That's their essence. Their essence is to teach us obedience. And following God's mysterious laws, at least mysterious to us, forces us to submit to something beyond and above ourselves. So it doesn't make sense to ask the question of why do we do this other than to say that it's a commandment. That's kind of the whole point. Okay, so that's one school of thought. But there's a second school of thought that contends that that this first explanation of chukim is unsatisfactory, because there must be a reason for these particular laws. Why else would God have given them to us? So if the rationales are mysterious to us, then maybe it's because we just haven't looked at them closely enough. So an example of that school of thought would be like the Rambam, who argues that many of these laws are meant to separate us from certain idolatrous practices, some of which we're no longer even acquainted. Right? So the Rambam tells us about how he read many books about idolatry, books of idolatry, to study up on the topic, which helped him understand that our rituals are meant, in part, some of these, chukim, are meant to stand out in their difference from certain idolatrous practices of biblical times. That's one way to explain it. A different way would be like the Ramban, who argues that certain of our ritual restrictions, like shatnez or kilayim, right, the laws of not mixing certain species, are meant to teach us to maintain the balance of the natural world. There's certain limits that people just shouldn't cross or things get out of balance. So again, this is not apparent when you first hear about these laws, but I guess for the second school of thought, to the extent that the meaning of the law is not apparent, it's because we haven't yet delved into its true depth. But with due inquiry, we can come to recognize certain hidden meanings of these laws. Okay, so to summarize, you have these two traditional ways of thinking about chukim. One that says that chukim are by their very essence beyond human understanding, and the second that chukim have deep, recognizable meanings if you just look closely enough. They're just not apparent. Okay, now Rabbi Sachs, again in this classic Rabbi Sachs way, suggests a third option, which you could say is a synthesis of the two. So I'm going to read a quote from Rabbi Sachs. So this is what he says. He says, there have been many interpretations of the chukim throughout the ages. But in light of recent neuroscience, we can suggest that they are laws designed to bypass the prefrontal cortex, the rational brain, and create instinctive patterns of behavior to counteract some of the darker emotional drives at work in the human mind. All right, I'm going to reread that because it's a lot. Okay, let me just reread it, and then we're going to try to figure it out. Okay, so again, he says there have been many interpretations of the chukim throughout the ages, but in the light of recent neuroscience, we can suggest that they are, and I think this is the punchline, laws designed to bypass the prefrontal cortex, the rational brain, and create instinctive patterns of behavior. Okay, so what's he getting at? So we have to unpack it a little bit. Rabbi Sachs starts with scientific discovery. He starts with an insight that came from the outside world. So diverse fields of study, psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, there are these different fields of study, but in some sense, they've come at the same thing from different directions and have a certain shared conclusion. And that is that our minds are far more complex than we might have at first realized, and they operate on multiple levels. So for example, we'll talk about this, a very basic level, but I think you have to spend a little bit of time on it to just get what Rabbi Sachs is talking about. Okay, so dating back to Freud, this is before anything, this is a little background, but it gives us a little bit of instinct. We take this for granted already, this concept of the conscious mind being kind of like the tip of the iceberg that sits on top of a vast subconscious that lies below the surface and that we barely understand and we certainly don't directly experience. Like that concept is filtered through, and apart from any of the details of Freud's various theories, like that's something that I think we've come to understand, that we, when we say we, right, experience only the conscious aspects of our lives, but there's a lot more going on inside of ourselves, inside of our own minds, that we don't experience directly and we probably don't fully understand. Okay, so that with that insight, so more recently, many of you may have read some of the works by Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who's famously described our minds as having two separate systems of thinking. The way he put it was thinking fast and slow. So just for those who may not have been acquainted with this, so a quick overview. So sometimes we think, you could say we think fast, okay? We think instinctually. We make snap decisions based on limited information and gut feelings. And those are things that gut feeling is something that we probably could never articulate to others in words, but we feel it to be true. We know it to be true in a way that we can't articulate. Okay, that's thinking fast. It just happens. Other times, we think slow. We reason our way through an issue explicitly and deliberately. We decide on our next steps in a thoughtful way. And those are things that we can explain. We can explain them in language to ourselves and to others. Okay. So to give a feel for this distinction, let's just think of a situation. Okay. So imagine that you hear a sound off in the distance, for example. Okay, snap. Almost immediately, without even trying, your mind does all kinds of calculations. It actually does some pretty complex things, but it does them. You could say that you at that point think fast. You locate, like, so you hear the sound off in the distance. Immediately, you locate the general sound, the general direction of the sound, and you quickly intuit whether it's something scary that you should run from or not. Okay? How do you figure that out so quickly? You don't figure out exactly what the sound is, but almost immediately you know whether you should turn or run or not. Your mind just does it, okay, without putting in any effort. There's no way to explain it to someone else. You just instantaneously know. But then once you've passed this immediate reaction, then slowly you might start to focus and say, oh, where exactly was that sound coming from? What exactly is it? Where have I heard that before? How would I get to that spot? How do I make a plan, maybe, right? So this is a different way of thinking. This is the slower, more deliberate way of thinking. And I think that we get intuitively, once you describe them, that these are two different ways that we experience thinking about things. Okay, and in some ways, this insight is similar to Freud's in recognizing that the mind operates on different levels, but as opposed to Freud, who made a point about the conscious mind that we experience and the unconscious that we don't, this is a dichotomy between two systems of mind that both fall within our conscious experience. Okay, so this is going to be the last of the science, but this is what I want to leave you with, is that these two systems, one system of thinking is intuitive, it's emotional, you could say. It's hard to describe in language, but deeply felt. It just happens without us even trying. We just know or feel something to be true. That's one. Second system is deliberate, rational, the kind of thing that you can explain to someone else in words, the kind of thing that we experience as it's happening. And this is the feeling of figuring something out. Okay. So that science about separating the rational, deliberate part of our minds from the intuitive, emotional part of our minds is what Rabbi Sachs is referencing when he says that chukim are laws designed to bypass the prefrontal cortex, which is the rational planning part of our brains. Okay. Instead, we'll see what he's saying these laws are meant to connect with the instinctive, intuitive, emotional, not rational, not entirely rational parts of our minds. So let's try to take that insight and unpack it by going through some examples. So let's look at an example of a law that the Torah calls a chok. So for example, take kashrut. Okay. Jews have a series of complex laws that governs what we eat and what we don't. And we might try to give all kinds of reasons for why kashrut makes sense. Okay, and there are many reasons that could be given. It teaches us self-restraint. It forces us to think about food, to appreciate what we eat. It forces an awareness of where meat comes from and to show concern for animals. And these are all wonderful reasons. But despite all of these reasons, as compelling as you might think they are, people looking at our tradition from the outside, be they Jewish or not Jewish, but looking from the outside, will often scoff at kashrut and give other reasons why it's silly. For example, why would you limit yourself from eating bacon? Don't you know how yummy it is, right? So, and if you turn to that person and you offer him all of your good reasons for why kashrut makes sense, it's very likely that they will not be convinced by the power of your amazing reason. Okay? It doesn't mean those reasons aren't good reasons, but probably not, you should not just expect that those are going to win the day. Okay, but here's the punchline. Anyone who actually keeps kosher understands that the experience of keeping kosher and keeping a kosher home can't be summed up by these rational arguments. And I think that's part of what Rabbi Sacks is teaching us is the essence of chok and the essence of ritual more broadly, right? It's not that these mitzvot don't have reasons, but perhaps, and it's not to say that studying those reasons is not important and internalizing those reasons is not important, but you can't sum up the experience of keeping the mitzvah and the benefits of keeping the mitzvah solely in terms of a list of reasons. And that's because chukim, ritual more broadly, affect us in ways that go beyond reason, beyond our ability to explain the experience of living them in words, right? And so let's take another example. So take the example of blowing a shofar, right? Another, ritual. So there have been many reasons given for why we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, right? It's to awaken us to tshuva. It's to coronate God as a king. It's to remind us of us and God of the story of Akedat Yitzchak, or maybe it's a form of prayer that goes beyond words. These are all, again, beautiful reasons, and they're important, and it's not to make light of them. And yet, all of these beautiful interpretations, or I should say none of these interpretations, and maybe not even all of them together, sum up what it is to blow the shofar in Shul on Rosh Hashanah. Because in some sense, we blow the shofar to move us in a way that goes beyond reason, beyond anything that we can actually explain. And the shofar calls out to us in an intuitive and emotional way to a part of ourselves that's different, and that the rational and deliberate part of ourselves can never sum up in words. So, okay, so hopefully that resonates a bit. And I think that's part of what Rabbi Sacks is trying to get at. And I'll try to maybe explain it in another way, maybe another metaphor for this, which is, so ritual at the end of the day is something that we perform, right? It's performative. It's meant to impact us in the way that other performances hit us deep down. And those things include, like, again, this is just a metaphor, but like music or drama, these are things that hit us in a very deep way, in a way that's hard to explain. So think about your favorite song, for example, a song that really deeply moves you. And then think about singing that song with friends. And then think about being at a concert where thousands of people are singing that song together in unison. And you can't put that feeling into words, but it would hit you very, very deeply. You would have like a real, true, and powerful experience, maybe as powerful as anything that you've ever felt. So ritual, ideally, is meant to be like that. It's supposed to move you in a non-rational way, but have it be deeply meaningful, right? And maybe the most powerful way, and even more powerful when we share it with others. Now, not every song is your favorite song, and you don't have the same emotional reaction every time you hear even your favorite song. So too with ritual, right? But the broader point, hopefully, is clear that just as music hits us in this intuitive and emotional way, that's somewhat of a metaphor for the way that ritual is meant to impact us beyond the limits of reason and more deeply than any reason or rationale could ever hit us. Okay, so I'm going to recap a little bit on kind of where we've been. So we saw that Rabbi Sacks bridges the divide between two Jewish schools of thought in respect to thinking about chukim. One that understands them as essentially not understandable. Perhaps their whole meaning comes from the fact that they're not understandable. The second that sees them as having subtle meanings that require us to think more about them. Rabbi Sacks offers that chukim are so hard to understand, kind of that first view, and that's true because they're meant to impact us in a way that's not entirely rational. Explaining chukim is a bit like, again, another metaphor to try to get this across. It's hard because the whole point of it is that this is hitting us in a way that is, because it's not part of our deliberate, rational way of thinking. It's the part of our mind. It's the process of mind that doesn't get captured well in words. So that's why we keep trying to use these metaphors. But here's another metaphor. Okay, so explaining chukim is a bit like close reading a poem or a song or studying a work of art. Okay, that process of learning the background and theory of a work of art can better help you appreciate it. But in the end, there's no analysis of the lyrics of a song or the tune or about the author or the background of when the song was written or any other kind of analysis that compares to the intuitive feel that you get when you hear it, right? Now, you actually may get a deeper feeling if you have that background and you know more about it. So it's not to say that that isn't helpful. It's extremely helpful, and maybe you have a richer, deeper feeling. But at the end of the day, what you get from hearing the song is a feeling. And the same is true of chukim. I think this is the insight, and of ritual generally. They create an experience that you can't sum up with arguments for or against, and maybe can't even sum up in words at all. So, okay, so that's kind of part one, is this introduction of Rabbi Sachs's explanation of chuk and of ritual more broadly. Okay, now I think you can't talk about chuk without at least thinking about different applications. Okay, so and we're going to look at an application of chuk, and we're going to look at an application to ritual more broadly. Okay, so let's start with a ritual that we all, sadly we know it intimately, and I think fits into this framework very well. Okay, so let's think about a background of death. Okay, because this is going to lead us into the paraduma. You can't escape it. Okay, so as background, when a close relative dies, we have laws. Okay, we have the laws of mourning. We have Shiva, we have Shloshim, we have Kaddish. So this is a perfect example. Death is beyond our understanding. So we have a series of rituals and practices that help us in an experiential way to get through the loss of a loved one, even if we can't rationally make sense of what's happened. So no words are sufficient to speak to us about death. So the halacha gives us an experience instead. Again, Shiva, Shloshim, Kaddish, etc. But now we're gonna approach the laws of paraduma by thinking about how this fits into the context. Okay, what happens when someone directly encounters death of someone other than a close relative? Okay, so the Torah gives us a way to acknowledge and be moved by death in that case as well, and that, I think you can argue, is what the paraduma is all about. Okay? Anyone that's encountered a dead body must go through this ritual before they can return to a condition of purity, to become tahor again. So that's not as involved as Shiva, but it's a ritual that nonetheless helps train us to be sensitive to and cope with the experience of encountering death. So what does the Torah tell us to do when we encounter a dead body? It doesn't give us a treatise on the meaning of life. It doesn't tell us what life and death is about or anything like that. Those are questions for philosophers. Those are questions for the rational part of our mind. The Torah instead gives us a ritual that's meant to be emotional and instinctive and reach that part of ourselves. And so think about what the paraduma kind of performance, right, with the paraduma ritual. But again, I want to use that word performance involves. We take an extremely rare animal. We take this red cow, and the animal is special and exceptional. It's described by the Torah as being without blemish and with no defect. We take this wonderful special animal and we burn down its carcass into ash. So without any words, the ritual plays out the problem that we face whenever we encounter death. A beautiful, unique life has been lost, and now what are we supposed to do? And the point is that there's no rational inquiry that can prepare you for death or explain death. What the Torah offers instead is a cathartic experience, the ritual of going to the Kohen before you're allowed to get back into normal life, right? And of course we can give reasons for what that accomplishes. So it forces us to acknowledge what's happened, right? You can't just move on and ignore or make light of the tragedy of the death that you encounter. You have to deal with it. Or you could say that it stops us from trying to deal with this experience alone. You have to deal with the situation in the context of a community. You have to go to the Kohen. This is similar to the way that we force a mourner to be social at Shiva, and we force them to say Kaddish at a minyan, and we force everyone who's encountered death into an experience of engaging with a community of the living, right? And then the ritual ends off with a goal that you should be renewed. The experience of being sprinkled with water is supposed to be reviving. Literally, it's ma'im chayim, living water. So just as the experience of coming out of a mikveh should feel like a rebirth, and just like we walk the mourner out of his house at the end of Shiva, so too the sprinkling of the water is meant to be reawakening. Okay, so these are all explanations of how the performance is meant to affect us. And the idea is that we need ritual most in situations where words don't suffice, where words wouldn't work. It wouldn't be enough to just talk to a person who's encountered death and try to get across these points in a rational way. It wouldn't make sense to just say to them, you really should deal with the fact that something serious has happened and not brush this off. You really should try to find friends and family or your community to talk with and deal with this as part of a larger group. Of course, you could say that, but it just wouldn't have the same impact. What the ritual gives you is an experiential way of dealing with grief in a way that no rational discussion can. And this, again, is in keeping with the way the Rabbi Sachs encourages us to think about chukim, that they're acts that are meant to impact us emotionally through experience without going through the rational part of our mind. Mourner doesn't benefit from philosophizing about the meaning of life. Benefits from Shiva, an experience that's meant to get across messages in a subtle way, maybe even unconsciously. And this way of understanding what the paraduma is about also helps explain the central paradox of the laws of paraduma, which is that the Kohen that applies the ashes of the paraduma himself becomes impure. So this is the big question that Chazal deal with. How can the thing that purifies the impure make the sprinkler become impure himself? How is that possible? But it starts to make sense when you think about not that it's supposed to make sense in a rational way, but when you think about the nature of the experience. So again, connecting this Shiva for your close relative versus paraduma for a not close relative, okay? When you go to a Shiva, right, when we give of ourselves by encountering death. We force ourselves, right? The mourner needs to feed off of us in order to be uplifted. We force ourselves to encounter death so that the mourner can go on with life. And in the same way, the sprinkler of the paraduma encounters death so that the person on the receiving end can move forward. So that's a thought. So okay, a final recap on this theme. So Rabbi Sachs uses the language of modern psychology to develop a way of looking at chukim. Science, in this explanation, gives us a language to help explain how certain mysterious laws of the Torah impact us. But at the same time, this is the second part of the move, Rabbi Sachs is pointing out that the Torah is way ahead of its time. In fact, it took science thousands of years to be able to explain something explicitly that something that the Torah was teaching us all along. And the Jewish ritual has been impacting us and our families for long before we had the scientific language to describe how it works. So that's a classic Rabbi Sachs. That's why I wanted to go through it. I think this is really, just a classic teaching by Rabbi Sachs. And so I'll end this year with one last thought. Going back to the story of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and the Roman pagan. Okay, so we saw that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai gives a so-so answer to the pagan. Right? He says basically, you have your forms of Mishigas, we have our forms of Mishigas. You do it your way, we do it our way. Okay, and the students call him out and they say that's not a great answer. And then he gives another answer to the students, which you might say is not the most amazing answer you ever heard. He basically says, because God said so. And maybe that's as good an answer as there is to give. And yet, I have to say that by the end of reading that, you don't feel like fully fulfilled by his answers. Okay. But maybe we should read that story with a little bit more depth. And another way, and I think this is actually consistent with Rabbi Sachs's broader point. Okay, when it comes to chukim, when it comes to ritual in general, you could say, there's only so far that you can go in trying to explain them rationally to anyone. So whether it's the pagan asking or the students asking, to give a definitive rational reason for why we do this, maybe is when it comes to ritual, and especially to these types of laws, maybe is just the wrong question in the first place. Right? The only way to understand these mitzvot is to practice them and to live them. And if you do, hopefully, you'll come to a different kind of understanding of the mitzvot, not necessarily in an analytical and purely rational way, but in an intuitive and experiential way. And the truth is that it's hard to be a practicing Jew and explain to other people in words exactly why we do what we do. That's why that story, I think, resonates with us. It's actually hard to give an answer in the way that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is asked to. And the truth is that it's hard to explain that fully in words to anyone. But as we saw tonight, I hope this is the takeaway, this is completely normal. This is actually how things work. It's actually how things are meant to work, right? Some of these things are meant to hit us in ways that go beyond words and beyond reason, and that actually is the power of them. So you kind of can't have it both ways, right? If you want that depth of feeling and intuitive and emotional response out of people, if you want to have some of these laws affect us, kind of the whole person, including not just our limited rational way of thinking about things, but also maybe the majority of the way that we actually interact with the world, which is through quicker, intuitive, not fully rational ways of processing, then it's probably too much to expect that you give, an exact rational explanation for each and every one of the things that we do. And in the end, it's that experience of living a Jewish life that we pass on to our children, right? Not what we say that they should do, not the theory of why we do these things, probably not even the details of some of the things that they might learn, but deeper than all of that. And again, you need all of that to have the depth of experience, right? Because if you're not educated in it, you can't have the depth of experience. But at the end of the day, it's the experience of actually doing these things together with our children, with our community, that hits us in the deepest way. So I'll leave it with that. I think that's a fitting final message to end the shir. We have a grandson in honor of his grandfather. I know that that for me personally, I have experiences, I have memories of experiences of having, again, gone to shul with my grandfather and just done these things, and that I think is a deeper experience and memory than any specific story that I could tell you. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you, everyone.
Shkoyach. You just made the case for a Jewish summer camp being so much even more important than school.
I love it. Anyways, thanks everyone. Great to see everyone.
That was for you, Phyllis and David.
Josh, that was a really, really beautiful shir. Yasher Koach. Rav Soloveitchik once said that he learned the laws of Shabbat from his father, but he learned about the experience and the beauty of Shabbat from his mother, and I guess the environment, the way she created that experience. Fantastic. Thank you, Josh. It's really beautiful.
That's a beautiful job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you, Josh. Here's Neshama Heaven Aliyah.
Thank you.
Yishkoach, terrific. Really enjoyed it very much.
So meaningful. Wonderful, wonderful legacy that your grandfather left for you. And we see the payroads. We see the wonderful results.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Josh. Was excellent.
All right, Leo says it was okay. Leo's a tough critic, so if he says it's okay, it's okay. Actually, it's funny. I went this morning. I was so Josie had her school had a thing where we went to daven with the kids this morning, and so I really liked it, because I thought, like, I've been thinking about all this stuff to give this shiur that I hope, I hope people will enjoy and get something out of. But then I thought this morning that just going to daven with, with Josie was like a much better tribute to my grandfather than like anything I was going to say tonight. So we still went through with it, but I really felt like this morning was like the real tribute to my grandfather.
You would have been very proud, Josh.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. We gave Kiddush here in Las Vegas